Black Swan, the 2010 film directed by Darren Aronofsky, reflects the protagonist Nina's struggle to unleash her dark side in order to reach artistic perfection and career success. In order to demonstrate a clear contrast between Nina's White Swan and Black Swan, the two sides embody the tropes and stereotypes typically associated with good and bad girls in the media, including the use of a queer relationship to indicate Nina's shift into her darker persona. However, the reliance on these characterizations could be said to have created a shallow and problematic depiction of women's lives and behaviors. This video essay aims to analyze these tropes and their uses within the film. Additionally, the purpose and moral message of the narrative have been called into question, especially in relation to commentaries on women's lives and experiences within systems of power. Amber Jacobs debates that the film reproduces and romanticizes patriarchal constructions of femininity without subversion, but others, such as Skorin Kapov, have disagreed. She states that it seems too restricted to relate the psychological and visual richness of Black Swan to the politics of gender, and instead argues that the psychological journey towards artistic liberation and self-destruction exists regardless of gender. The context within which the film was made also needs to be taken into consideration. With a team of male writers and a male director, it's whether they could honestly capture the female experience within a story with predominantly female characters, without relying on and perpetuating stereotypes. This video essay will largely refer to the works of Jadranka Skorin Kapov, Katarina Linda, Gemma Comane, and Mark Fisher and Amber Jacobs, in order to dissect and analyze the representations of women within Black Swan. One of the first distinctions drawn between Nina's timid White Swan persona and the Black Swan is sexual motivation. This somewhat commodifies the association with the female sexuality and the bad girl trope. Comane discusses how bad women are associated with certain forms of sexual behavior and sexual practices. We see this plenty in Black Swan. Nina's clean-cut, innocent personality, which is demonstrated through her childlike bedroom, quiet and disciplined demeanor, and implied virgin status, is solidly linked to the White Swan persona, the epitome of a good girl. This is then contrasted with the Black Swan persona, who is typically a villain within the narrative of Swan Lake. This role becomes associated with certain sexual behaviors as Nina is instructed to explore her sexuality for what appears to be the first time in order to achieve the perfect Black Swan performance. This is demonstrated through Nina trying masturbation, sexual advancements made on and by Thomas, and an imagined same-sex relationship with Nina's rival Lily. This therefore creates a connection between women's sexual agency and desires and becoming a bad girl. Gemma Comane also discusses the dirty connotation of same-sex relationships, which is something else we see used in Black Swan. Comane states, bisexuality and other non-normative identities such as women who identify as kinky or into BDSM and fetish are still associated with bad women. In the narrative, Nina's imagined sexual encounter with Lily symbolizes her shift from a good girl persona to that of the Black Swan. There is almost this assumption that straying from typical heterosexual relationships is inherently rebellious or bad. The purpose of this scene is also worth questioning. It's whether it was necessary for the depiction of Nina's psychological journey, or if it was placed for male audience gratification. Linda discusses how Black Swan is critically engaging with the heterosexual romance narratives that are entangled with the dance performances, and the relationship with Lily is meant to be a subversion of this, demonstrating how Nina's Black Swan persona is breaking the mold. However, Jacobs argues that this scene reproduces the standard iconography of soft porn and functions entirely for the pleasure of the heterosexual male spectator. The over-sexualization of queer relationships in films is a recurring issue, with most same-sex romances heavily featuring sex scenes, sometimes to an unnecessary extent. A prime example of this is Blue is the Warmest Color, the 2013 film, where the majority of the film is dedicated to drawn-out and graphic lesbian sex scenes. It is marketed as a queer romance, but it gathered a lot of controversy for bordering on pornography. to the extent that it made the actors uncomfortable. It is possible that Black Swan could be inadvertently conforming to this trope whilst trying to demonstrate an artist's struggle for liberation under a patriarchal system. It could also be significant that when trying to bring out Nina's inner Black Swan, Thomas only focuses on her sexuality without suggesting any other lifestyle changes or methods, such as being more spontaneous and social. It is questionable that while trying to demonstrate the pressure and struggles of an artist seeking perfection and liberation, Aronofsky chose to primarily focus on Nina's sexuality. This could highlight the male perspective that this story is being told by, and the male audience that they might be catering to. Lily is the only other character to inspire behaviour changes by taking Nina out to a bar and drugging her drink. However, this could also be interpreted as Lily having ulterior motives of sabotage. Additionally, it is this event that leads to another sexually motivated encounter. Nina's relationships with other women within the film are mostly oppositional. She seeks to break free from her overbearing mother Erica. She succeeds Beth, a former lead dancer, and her colleague Lily, who embodies the freedom and rebellion that Nina doesn't possess, is positioned as the rival character. Rivalry and competitiveness are prominent in films with female protagonists, such as The Devil Wears Prada and The Neon Demon, where the main character is pitted against other women, often in the workplace or in a battle over a lover. Both of these scenarios are present in Black Swan, and it could be argued that this creates a shallow depiction of women's relationships with one another. Mayer describes the effects of this trope being used in The Neon Demon, stating it reinforces sexist ideas of young women as narcissistic, spiteful, and competitive, and results in weak and one-dimensional characterization. The director Refn aimed to highlight the cutthroat and competitive nature of the modelling industry, similar to Aronofsky's intention for Black Swan, to demonstrate the struggle for success within the ballet world. It has been debated that the combative relationships within the film are vital to serving the purpose of the narrative. Fisher argues that Nina's relationship with other women shows the damage that the patriarchy has done, and without it, the story would lack the tension and horror it requires to make an impact. However, it is curious that the character of Thomas, the only male character, is not vilified as much as the female characters, if the aim was to represent the ways in which women suffer under systems created and ruled by men. Jacobs makes a point of discussing the lack of critique within the narrative, instead suggesting that Black Swan simply replicates the conditions of the patriarchy without resistance. During the climax of the film, Nina is presented as her own villain and saboteur, which ultimately results in her ambiguous demise. But as she lies bleeding from her self-inflicted wound, she is satisfied, having reached ultimate perfection. Consequently, this almost condones and makes the conditions that led to her fate acceptable in the eyes of the viewer. Thomas's characterization is also worth examining in the context of his role as the mentor and the way his abuse is excused and almost ignored within the film. Skorin Prakapov describes Thomas as a choreographer who tries to awaken Nina's artistic potential with sometimes quite unorthodox measures. These methods include sexually assaulting and coercing her numerous times, and introducing the constant threat of being replaced. Yet the film portrays this as something she needed in order to access her inner Black Swan. Damien Chazelle's Whiplash includes a similar mentor figure, Terence Fletcher, a feared music instructor. As Begley describes, Fletcher is verbally and physically abusive and pushes his students to the limit, resulting in a mentioned suicide. However, Begley states that although he is manipulative, abusive, and dishonest, he is not portrayed as someone to be emulated. Within the narrative of the film, Fletcher's character is positioned as the villain, and he is somewhat punished for his abuse when the protagonist Neiman reports Fletcher, allowing Neiman to triumph over him briefly. This is not the case in Black Swan. The film implies Thomas's power is on a similar level to Fletcher's, with his former prodigy Beth implied to have attempted suicide due to the distress of replacement. However, Thomas never faces any consequences or repercussions. This is not the only point of comparison. Narratively, Whiplash and Black Swan are quite similar. Both depict a character's obsession with artistic perfection, facing self-destruction and challenging mentors. But Whiplash criticizes the effect Fletcher, the mentor, has on Neiman, the student. As we watch his descent, we are not positioned to approve of Neiman's actions as he becomes consumed by his goals, aggressive and isolated. Conversely, in Black Swan, Nina's journey is presented as one of liberation, and as Fisher states, Thomas represents a hypersexualized version of the kind of therapeutic wisdom widely disseminated by the likes of Oprah Winfrey. The change he provokes is suggested to be positive despite the pain and suffering Nina undergoes as a result of it, once again demonstrated by the satisfaction Nina feels as she ends her final performance. It is also worth questioning if the gender of the protagonist factors into how their abuse is represented and dealt with within the narrative. Neiman, a male protagonist, is allowed to stand his ground against Fletcher, yet Nina, being female, isn't shown to defy or resist Thomas. This could partly be due to women historically being taught to be subservient and accepting of male dominance, and the male writers of Black Swan continuing to perpetuate this, intentionally or not. It could be argued that the overriding issue for Black Swan is perhaps a lack of nuance. The film attempted to explore sexual liberation, but without adequate female perspective, it instead relied on the established conventions of the Western male imaginary and phallocentrism. This consequently also led into the inclusion of soft porn tropes when depicting a lesbian sexual encounter, and the protagonist lacked desire and agency. The same applies to the film's aim to demonstrate oppression and opposition. Whilst trying to examine the conditions of the patriarchy, the female characters lost dimension and humanity, and bordered on embodying misogynistic stereotypes with rivalries and competitiveness without much motivation or development. And finally, whilst representing the effects of an abusive mentor figure and attempting to comment on the power systems within the ballet industry, the film didn't offer critique and resistance, so it appeared to only enforce and approve of these systems. We see Nina almost grateful for what she has had to endure, and Thomas suffering no consequences. But instead of positioning the audience to view this as a cautionary tale or a critique of society, the message of the film comes off more as being about the price of perfection and self-destruction.